Trevor Stone's red hair was already frozen with sweat beneath his helmet when the first orbital strike hit. The ground buckled, throwing him against the trench wall. Ice crystals rained down as the thermal barriers struggled to maintain integrity. Someone was screaming, maybe everyone was screaming, but the sound was lost in the roar of superheated plasma turning the battlefield into steam. "Keep your head down," newbie Sergeant Walsh grabbed Trevor's collar, yanking him deeper into the trench as another strike illuminated the perpetual twilight of Pollis-14. First day's always the worst. Trevor wasn't sure he believed that. How could anything be worse than this? The training simulations hadn't prepared him for the reality, the way the ground never stopped shaking, the constant thunder of artillery, the knowledge that meters of ice were all that stood between him and hard vacuum when the thermal barriers failed. "Contact front," the call echoed down the line. Trevor raised his rifle with trembling hands, the weight of it suddenly unfamiliar. Through the steam clouds, dark shapes moved like demons in the mist. The veteran soldiers around him opened fire, plasma bolts cutting blue streaks through the chaos. "Shoot," Stone Walsh roared. "Shoot or we all die." Trevor squeezed the trigger. The recoil compensators caught most of the kick, but his shots went wide, superheating chunks of ice into steam. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking. God, why wouldn't they stop shaking? The enemy advance faltered under sustained fire, pulling back into the perpetual fog of war that shrouded the battlefield. Trevor's breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air. He'd survived his first contact. He hadn't run. That had to count for something. "You'll get better," Walsh said, checking the thermal barriers. "Or you'll die. No middle ground out here." Night brought no relief. The aurora painted everything in sickly green light, and the enemy artillery never ceased. Trevor huddled in his designated shelter space, trying to write a letter home. What could he say? That he'd nearly wet himself during the orbital strike. That he couldn't stop shaking even hours after the fighting had died down. "Dear Mom. The front is exactly what they said it would be. I'm doing fine. The veterans are helping me adjust." He deleted the message. Everything he wrote felt like a lie. "Can't sleep." Private Walden, a veteran of 3 months in eternity on Pollis-14, sat down beside him. "First week, I didn't sleep at all. Kept hearing the strikes even when it was quiet." "Does it get easier?" Trevor asked, hating how young his voice sounded. "No, but you get harder." Walden offered him a ration bar. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Trevor took a bite, not tasting it. His hands had finally stopped shaking, but now his whole body felt numb. Whether from the cold or the fear, he couldn't tell anymore. The night dragged on. Trevor dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every distant explosion. In his dreams, the ice cracked open, swallowing him whole. He woke gasping, throat raw from screaming. Dawn brought a new horror. The enemy had breached a section of the line during the night. Trevor followed Walsh's unit to reinforce the position, moving through trenches that had become morgues. Frozen bodies stared with accusing eyes, their last moments preserved in the ice. "Don't look," Walsh ordered. "Focus on your footing. Watch the thermal barriers. Stay alive." A collapse further down the line trapped them in their section. Steam vents from damaged barriers filled the enclosed space. Trevor's breathing came faster and faster. The walls seemed to close in. His vision tunneled. Stone Walsh's voice cut through the panic. "Count your magazines, now." Trevor's trembling fingers found his ammunition pouches. 1, 2, 3. The simple task anchored him. By the time he finished, the rescue team had cleared the collapse. That evening, Trevor tried writing home again. "Dear Mom. Today I learned that fear has a taste. It tastes like metal and ice. They didn't tell us that in training. They didn't tell us a lot of things. I'm scared, all the time. But I'm still here, still fighting. I don't know if that makes me brave or just too terrified to run. Love. Trevor." He deleted this message too. Instead, he cleaned his rifle, checked his gear, and prepared for another night on Pollis-14's front line. Tomorrow would bring more artillery, more attacks, more moments of stark terror. But tonight, his hands had stopped shaking long enough to reload his weapon. On this frozen hell of a world, that counted as progress. Walsh found him later, doing equipment checks for the third time. "You survived your first day, Stone. That's something." "Yeah," Trevor said quietly, his red hair catching the aurora's light. "Something." Above them, the first orbital strike of the night lit up the sky like a new sun. Trevor's hands started shaking again, but this time he kept checking his gear, one task at a time, one moment at a time. It was all anyone could do on the front lines of Pollis-14. 3 weeks on Pollis-14 had taught Trevor Stone many things: how to sleep through artillery barrages, how to spot signs of imminent thermal barrier failure, how to keep his weapon functioning in temperatures that could freeze hydraulic fluid. Most importantly, he'd learned that true terror wasn't the sharp spike of fear during combat, it was the constant, gnawing dread of waiting for the next attack. Movement, Sector 7. Trevor snapped his rifle up at Walden's call. The motion automatic now. Through his scope, he could see them enemy infantry using the steam clouds for cover. His hands still shook, but he'd learned to time his shots between tremors. "They're probing again," Walsh muttered from his position. "Too many probes. Something's coming." As if summoned by his words, the sky erupted. Not the usual orbital strikes, this was different. Multiple capital ships entering atmosphere, their engines turning the cloud cover into a roiling inferno. "All units, brace for assault." The command channel crackled with urgency. Multiple enemy dropships detected. They're pushing all sectors. The next hours became a blur of desperate combat. Enemy troops hit their lines in waves, using the chaos of orbital bombardment as cover. Trevor fired until his rifle's heat sink glowed red, then kept firing. The front trench was breached, then retaken, then breached again. All back to secondary positions. Walsh's order cut through the mayhem. Stone, Walden, covering fire. They laid down, suppressing fire as their unit retreated. Steam and weapons fire turned the battlefield into a strobing nightmare. Trevor could barely see, his visor covered in ice crystals that formed from his own ragged breathing. The pain hit him like a hammer blow. One moment he was firing, the next he was spinning, his left shoulder exploding in agony. The enemy round had punched through his armor, where an earlier impact had weakened it. He felt the hot splash of blood freezing instantly against his skin. "Man down!" Walden's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Stone's hit." Trevor tried to stand, but his body wouldn't respond. The pain was everywhere now, radiating from his shoulder in waves of fire. He could hear the battle continuing around him, see flashes of plasma fire through his frosting visor. "Stay with me." Kid Walsh appeared above him, dragging him toward cover. "Medics incoming. Just stay awake." The world narrowed to points of sharp clarity, the red of his blood against white ice, the sound of his heartbeat drowning out the battle, Walsh's constant stream of encouragements and threats. "You don't get to die here, Stone. That's an order." The field medic arrived in a blur of motion, cutting away Trevor's armor with practiced efficiency. The pain spiked as they applied emergency sealant to the wound. Someone was screaming. He realized it was him. Leaned through and through, the medic reported. "He's lucky. Half a meter lower would have hit the lung." Lucky. Trevor would have laughed if he could. Lucky wasn't lying in the ice while your own blood froze around you. Lucky wasn't watching your unit continue fighting while you were helpless. Lucky wasn't. The sedatives hit, and the world went mercifully dark. He woke in the medical station 2 kilometers behind the line. The pain had dulled to a persistent throb, but every heartbeat sent a fresh spike of agony through his shoulder. Through the station's reinforced walls, he could hear the battle continuing. "Welcome back." Walden sat beside his bed, her armor still showing scorch marks from combat. "You had us worried." The line, Trevor's voice was raw. "Did we hold?" "Thanks to the covering fire you laid down. Walsh says you did good." She helped him sit up. "Of course, he also says you're an idiot for getting shot." Trevor managed a weak smile. The fear was still there, it was always there, but it felt different now. More distant somehow. He'd taken what he'd dreaded most since arriving: a direct hit. He'd survived. The knowledge sat in his chest like a warm coal. Through the station's viewport, he could see fresh troops moving up to the front. More young soldiers, probably just as terrified as he'd been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks that felt like 3 lifetimes. "They're saying you'll be back on the line in 2 weeks," Walden said, watching him watch the newcomers. "Assuming you want to come back." Trevor touched his bandaged shoulder, feeling the pain lance through him. He thought about running, about requesting a rear assignment. The fear whispered that it would be easier, safer. But he thought about Walsh and Walden, still fighting on the line, about the terrified replacements who would need someone to show them how to survive. "I'll be back," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Someone has to teach the new kids how to not get shot. Walden smiled. "Now you're starting to sound like a real soldier." Outside, the battle for Pollis-14 raged on. Trevor Stone lay in his hospital bed, feeling the pain of his first combat wound and listening to the distant thunder of war. He was still scared he'd always be scared. But now he knew something the fresh troops didn't. There were things worth being scared for. His hands were steady as he finally wrote home. "Dear Mom, I got shot today. I'm okay. For the first time since I got here, I think I might actually mean that. Love, Trevor." This time, he hit send. Trevor Stone returned to the front line 13 days after being shot. His shoulder still ached in the cold, which meant it ached constantly on Pollis-14, but the medical officers had cleared him for duty. The battlefield had changed during his absence. The enemy's push had transformed the once orderly network of trenches into a maze of craters and hastily fortified positions. "Welcome back," Stone Walsh greeted him at the forward command post. "Hope you enjoyed your vacation." Trevor adjusted his rifle sling to better accommodate his healing shoulder. "Heard I missed some excitement." "That's one word for it." Walsh led him to their new position. "We've got fresh meat coming in. You're on babysitting duty." The fresh meat arrived an hour later, 3 replacements, their armor still factory clean. Trevor saw himself in their wide eyes and nervous movements. One of them, a boy who couldn't be more than 18, was shaking so badly he could barely check his weapon. "I'm Stone," he introduced himself. "First rule, the shaking never stops. Learn to work with it." "Does it get easier?" the boy asked, echoing Trevor's own question from what felt like a lifetime ago. No, Trevor helped him adjust his grip on his rifle. "But you get stronger. Watch the thermal barriers. Keep your weapon clean. Stay close to veterans." The attack came at dawn. Not the probing attacks Trevor had grown used to, but a massive assault preceded by the heaviest orbital bombardment he'd seen yet. The sky turned to fire as enemy capital ships engaged coalition defense platforms in low orbit. Multiple breaches in sectors 3 through 8. The command channel was chaos. "All units hold the line." Trevor found himself moving with a calm he wouldn't have believed possible weeks ago. The fear was still there, burning in his gut, but now it sharpened his senses instead of dulling them. "Martinez, Walden, watch our left flank," he ordered the replacements. "Williams with me." The young soldier who'd been shaking earlier fell in beside him, moving exactly as Trevor had shown him. Together, they laid down suppressing fire as enemy troops pushed through a gap in the thermal barriers. "We can't hold this position," Walsh called over the tactical channel. "Too many points of failure in the barriers." Trevor scanned the battlefield, seeing not just the chaos but the patterns within it. "The maintenance tunnels," he said suddenly. "The ones under the old trench line, they're still intact." Walsh caught his meaning immediately. "Stone, take your team. Get down there and give them a surprise. We'll keep their attention up here." Trevor led his small team through the access hatch, into the relative quiet of the maintenance tunnels. Their boots crunched on frozen ground as they moved beneath the battle raging overhead. Sir Williams whispered, his voice shaking but determined. "What are we doing?" "Winning," Trevor replied, checking his tactical display. "Enemy forces are focused on the barrier breaches. They're not watching their rear." They emerged behind the enemy advance, taking them completely by surprise. Trevor's first shots dropped 2 enemy soldiers before they knew what was happening. The rest of his team opened fire, creating chaos in the enemy ranks. Push now! Walsh's voice roared over the comm as the coalition forces above took advantage of the confusion. Drive them back. The battle shifted. Caught between hammer and anvil, the enemy advance faltered, then broke. Trevor led his team in pursuit, securing positions as they moved forward. His shoulder burned with every shot, but he barely noticed. Hours later, as coalition reinforcements finally arrived to secure their gains, Trevor found himself back in the command post with Walsh. "Not bad for someone fresh off medical leave," the sergeant said, cleaning his weapon. "The brass is saying your tunnel maneuver might have saved the whole sector." Trevor flexed his healing shoulder, feeling the familiar ache. The replacements did well. They had good training. Walsh gave him a knowing look. "Fear keeps you alive out here. Courage is just fear that's learned discipline." Later, as the aurora painted the battlefield in its ethereal light, Trevor walked the line, checking on his team. Williams was at his post, his hands steady on his weapon. The other replacements were learning, adapting, surviving, just as he had. His personal comm chirped a message from home. "Dear Trevor, we got your last letter. Your father says getting shot is a Stone family tradition now. Please don't make it one. Stay safe. Stay strong. Love, Mom." Trevor smiled, composing his reply. "Dear Mom, today I led a team in combat. Really led them not just following orders, but making decisions, keeping them alive. I'm still scared. Every day, every battle. But I've learned something important. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway. I think I finally understand what Dad meant about war showing you who you really are. Tell him his son is doing okay out here. Love, Trevor." He sent the message and returned to his position. Above, the aurora continued its eternal dance over Pollis-14's scarred surface. Enemy capital ships still lurked in high orbit, their presence promising more battles to come. The war was far from over. But Trevor Stone, the terrified red-headed boy who had arrived on this frozen world, was gone. In his place stood a soldier who had learned to turn fear into strength, terror into purpose. His hands still shook as he checked his weapon, but now he understood it wasn't weakness that made them shake, but the constant reminder that he was still alive, still fighting, still human. On the battlefield of Pollis-14, that was victory enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you loved it. Please remember to subscribe if you did like it so you can see more videos like this. And please give us a like and a comment too. I'll see you in the next one.